Welcome to the Ultimate Ukraine channel. The Ukrainian war has now moved to a completely different dimension. Russian President Vladimir Putin used all the trump cards in his hand, but after about 10 months, the Ukrainian armed forces established a great advantage against the Russian army. When Putin entered the war on February 24th, his target was the capital of Ukraine, Kiev. However, when we look back at the front now, it seems that Ukraine has its eyes on the Crimea. Even the top Ukrainian officials have now begun to give the date of entry of the Ukrainian armed forces into Crimea. At this point, we might have thought that Ukraine's goals a few months ago were unrealistic. However, if we follow the progress of the Ukrainian armed forces in Kherson and the developments in Melitopol in the recent days, we see that this goal is getting closer every day. Ukraine's liberation of the city of Kherson at the beginning of November was more than a dramatic military victory. Ukraine saw Russian President Vladimir Putin's bluff in his victory on the battlefield. Just 2 months ago, Putin publicly declared Kherson and other Ukrainian lands as part of Russia and indirectly placed them under Russian nuclear protection. Putin had hoped that the fear of a nuclear attack would force Ukraine to underestimate and push its supporters to back down. But his plan didn't work. The offensive in Kherson is unlikely to be the end of Ukraine's successful counteroffensive. The biggest prize lies further south. Putin's pearl, Crimea, is no longer an inaccessible target for the Ukrainian armed forces. The Crimean Peninsula, where the war started in 2014, is waiting for the day when the Ukrainians will be avenged. A Ukrainian deputy defense minister announced that the country's army could enter Crimea by the end of December. Such statements may be an evasion aimed at intimidating Russia, or they may be an open challenge, as before the Kherson offensive. With the liberation of Kherson, Crimea certainly came into view for Ukraine. Russia may well have dug into the vicinity of Crimea, but if the war has shown anything so far, it's that Russia could lose territory, and it could be out of the hands of the Russian army very quickly. The Crimean War is certainly possible. Some war analysts might find Ukraine's move bold. However, while this is a necessary step in one sense, it should be seen as a possible step from another point of view. Ukraine's international partners have made a pledge to defend Ukraine's territorial integrity. Russia has an interest in controlling its military power and preventing a reoccupation of Ukraine. If Crimea remains in Russia's hands, it threatens Ukraine's security. It should not be forgotten that this Russian threat will not only be against Ukraine, and Russia has always been a threat to NATO's operations in the Black Sea. Russia's invasion of 2022 was staged partly from Crimea. The Crimean Peninsula is a dagger aimed not only at the Black Sea, but also at Kiev. And annexed Crimea was not the limit to Russia's imperial ambitions, as many Western leaders hoped in 2014. Rather, it was the stepping stone to those ambitions. As you may recall, when Vladimir Putin set his sights on Kiev, he implied that the Russian army would march on Poland right afterwards. We even saw that the Ukrainian armed forces carried out many airstrikes that we all followed. In mid-November, attacks on the Russian presence in Crimea increased, and the Russian Navy was routed there by Ukrainian drone armies. At the moment, the Russian Navy is more cautious in the Crimea and has to pull its warships to safer positions. However, on the night of the end of the war's 10 months, Ukraine set off fireworks in the Crimea. The Kremlin's concerns were reignited as the attack on the Crimea, near the village of Nizhnogorsky, on 24th of December, illuminated the Crimean skies. A violent explosion occurred in Nizhnogorsky, in eastern Crimea. We are talking about a kamikaze drone aimed at the local railway junction or the oil depot located there. Relevant video footage of the night attack was released by local residents. Nizhnogorsky roared with a powerful explosion. Shortly before the explosion, local residents heard gunfire and the sound of drones and managed to record the moment of the attack. Although the Russian military stated that it shot down the drone, no reports were published, nor was this information confirmed. The Ukrainian armed forces are trying to break through the Russian defense in Crimea with similar attacks. However, the Crimean offensive of the Ukrainian armed forces will be much more difficult than any other offensive, because it should not be forgotten that Crimea has been under Russian control for about 8 years. Frankly, it's not Crimea Kherson. It occupies a different place in the war, and many Western allies have serious concerns about escalation over Crimea. Vladimir Putin could lose in Kherson or anywhere in Ukraine and accept his losses. It could even lose and politically control Donbass, a part of eastern Ukraine that Russia has occupied since 2014. But Putin sees losing Crimea and surviving as president absolutely irreconcilable. He will do his best to keep Crimea in his hands. This can be a difficult order. Ukraine has already demonstrated the vulnerability of Crimea with Russia's attacks on the Black Sea Fleet and its attacks on the bridge over the Kerch Strait, which connects Russia with Crimea. It should continue to exert military pressure on the Crimea and advance in the southern Kherson region. Ideally, Kiev would regain control of the freshwater canal that supplied Crimea with most of its water. Ukraine should at any moment frighten Russia from the invasion of Crimea. For now, though, it would be wise to squeeze and isolate Russian troops into the Crimea without attempting to reconquer the peninsula. The strategy will give Kiev a strong position in future negotiations with Russia and will likely persuade the Kremlin to enter such negotiations seriously. This will help maintain unity among Ukraine's Western partners who are concerned about the risk of escalation. More urgently, Ukraine may seek to break the land bridge to Crimea by separating Russia's forces in the south from those in the east and regaining access to the Sea of Azov. A costly and dangerous campaign to retake the peninsula now could risk the counteroffensive that Ukraine has so brilliantly pursued since September. However, the explosion at the Kerch Bridge seriously frightened the Russian army and suggested that the supply routes would be completely closed. This should not be forgotten either. Ukraine's most basic strategy in recent months is to wipe them off the map after the Russian army closes its supply lines. It would be enough to scare the Kremlin that Ukraine may have applied the phased war tactic in the Crimea as well, because at this point, the door of Crimea is about to close completely to the Russians. If the Russian army loses the western part of the Dnieper River and Melitopol, the Crimea will enter a major bottleneck. The annexation of Crimea was popular in Russia. Except for Russia, the status of Crimea is final. It is internationally recognized as the territory of Ukraine. Until Russia withdraws from Crimea, Ukraine's sovereignty will be in jeopardy. Growing problems in Crimea will reduce Ukraine's chances of joining Western institutions such as NATO and the European Union. Both organizations are hesitant to accept new members with unresolved regional issues, which is one reason Putin wants to stay in Crimea forever. But none of this can prevent a Crimean war in which Russia is hardly guaranteed to win. But on the other hand, these reasons increase Kiev's appetite for annexing Crimea back to Ukraine. If such a war takes place, three threats will arise. Most importantly, the possibility of nuclear escalation. Since the invasion in February 2022, Putin has had to reconfigure his war aims, contradicting himself along the way. The so-called special military operation to consolidate the territory in the Donbass was actually a maximalist war against Ukraine. Putin has since ordered a mobilization, declared war with the West, and sought to annex 4 southern regions of Ukraine. This was a theatrical gesture that could not hide the fact that Russia had surrendered most of the lands it had taken since February 24th. Implicit nuclear threats followed Putin's annexation. Ukraine has demonstrated that these threats are futile, as they took back large areas of recently annexed territory from Russia, and Russia did not respond with a nuclear escalation. No matter how much Vladimir Putin seems to be a warmonger, he always keeps his hands secret. He decided to mobilize for the Ukraine war, but following the advice of his dissenting allies, he did not launch an all-out attack on Ukraine. However, as we mentioned above, Crimea is Vladimir Putin's red line. If this line is crossed, he can make much harder moves. Putin, who has not neglected the nuclear threat in the last period, as he did at every stage of the war, may engage in such a frenzy if the Crimean War takes place. In statements from the USA, it is said that there was no problem in Ukraine's use of US and NATO weapons in the attacks on Crimea. With these explanations, this war can be reworked on a much larger plane. As with every move, Kiev should take its steps very carefully. Otherwise, it may face a great loss and may have to face a result that the whole world does not want by taking the war to a completely different dimension. How do you think Kiev should proceed at this point? We would like to communicate with you again in the comments on the subject, which we have examined from all sides. Thanks for watching.